Good afternoon. My apologies for not being there with you in person. I had a last minute change in plans and was not able to travel to be there. But I am thrilled nonetheless to be here with you live on video. And I'm very grateful to Steve Cerisi and to NCME for inviting me to be part of the Remembering Ron Reflections on a Career and Legacy Symposium. My focus is on Ron Hambleton's advances in detecting item bias and differential item functioning. There are 4 sections to my presentation. The first is to set some sort of general remarks to sort of set the stage. Although I'm focusing on a small slice of Ron's research program, I'm sure you can imagine how precarious it feels to try and capture such a productive and influential scholarly life as Ron Hambleton's in a limited number of words and slides. So I'm going to relieve myself of any such aspirations and share with you my focused rereading of a small slice of his research. It's a personal account. It's an account with charts and graphs and counts. They're like frosting on a cake to draw you in. The central message, one that I shared, that I've learned from Ron and that I'll share with all of you, is that the study of psychometrics, measurement, testing, survey design, must be grounded in a thorough knowledge of the past, the history of the disciplinary field of, in this case, psychometrics and measurement, so to speak, grounded in the knowledge of the past, the history of the discipline, but it's also the history and the past of the community that you're working in, because that becomes important in shaping how we think through the problems and make some of the claims that we're making. There also has to be grounded in a love for dialogue and disseminating ideas to push the field forward, and a readiness to roll up your sleeves and get in the muck of the details to do good in our communities locally, nationally, and globally. Let me say a few words about differential item functioning, even though I'm sure most in the room and most listening will know something about it. Methods for detecting differential item functioning, diff and item bias, including factorial invariance, are widely used. They're used in the process of item analysis when developing new measures, in adapting existing measures for use in new settings, or with populations not initially intended when the measure was developed, for adapting existing measures to new languages and or cultures, or more generally validating test score inferences. These methods allow one to judge whether items and ultimately the tests they constitute are functioning in the same manner for various groups of examinees. The question driving this thematic research is whether individuals respond to questions on tests or surveys in a consistent manner, such that, for example, a measurement model can be constructed that is equivalently applicable to all people in the target population. And our measurement models can be rather comparatively straightforward, with very few parameters that are being estimated, to these very highly elaborate hyperparameterized models that you'll see sometimes today here at the conference, in journals and in practice. For example, are the respondents comprising the sample exchangeable with respect to the measurement model? This becomes important. The question is typically interpreted as whether individuals consistently interpret test or survey items reflecting the intended knowledge, attitude, attribute, or disposition being measured. Along with his many other contributions to educational and psychological measurement, Ron Hambleton has contributed consistently and contributed considerably to the literature on diff and item bias through many journal and chapter publications and presentations. I aim to describe how Ron's thematic research program had an impact on methods and practice of detecting item bias, and differential item functioning, factorial invariance. The focus is on the formal, the sort of diff and bias rather than the factorial approach, although there's some of that will come through as well. We're going to be highlighting item-centered and test-centered approaches. The focus is mostly on the item-centered. Applications and developments of methods and exemplars of good practice. Ron's thematic research addressing the detection of differential item functioning and factorial invariance emerged in the mid-1980s, at least 37 years ago by all accounts that I have. And it's resulted in significant advances in the psychometric methods and research methodology for detecting diff, factorial invariance, and the refinement of these methods. As Hambleton in 2006 noted, most of their work has been with achievement tests and binary scored items, but that work easily generalizes to other types of instruments and the polymorphically scored data, such as might come from rating scales and health measures, psychological measures, ed psych, special education, healthcare, etc. Ron's thematic research addressing the detection of differential item functioning and factor really emerged, as I said, in about 37 years ago. Mid-1980s, 86 is the earliest that I have of the documents that I've been able to retrieve. And it resulted in advances that really have wide applicability in educational psychological measurement, cross-cultural assessment, educational research, health research and healthcare, credentialing exams, and language testing. It is remarkable to see a career that's impacted so broad areas that are using our methods. Our disciplines have become so siloed, and it was remarkable to see Ron's achievement and his contributions across all of them. I take this as a model, to be honest, for my own work. Let me turn now to a brief demonstration of the impact of this research program using some sort of quantitative bibliometric kind of analyses. So his overall body of work has included at least 5 discernible sub-themes. This is overall, and actually likely more depending on your read of the work. So his overall body of work, you'll see it in today's session, is at least 5 discernible sub-themes. And these are interrelated, of course. Any of these sub-themes may appear dwarfed by the whole body of work. And we're going to see that in a few moments here. I conducted a bibliometric analysis using citation count metrics to give us a broad picture of the impact. Final count on March 10th, 2023, using Google Scholar. I chose Google Scholar because it provides a simple way to broadly search for scholarly literature across a wide variety of disciplines and sources, articles, theses, books, abstracts, court opinions, etc. Other search engines are more narrow. I actually, for our purposes here, prefer the wider net that's cast with Google Scholar. I acknowledge that citation counts in Google Scholar have limitations, but they're adequate for our descriptive purposes today. Here is a look at a citation, a cumulative counts of a citation, starting from 1968. And you can see it's quite remarkable, just nearly 45,000 citations cumulatively. This is of his overall body of work, and it's 1968 to now. The overall citations I was able to find were 44,372 with an H index of 82. And the H index is this, get this function that is ordered in decreasing order from largest, smallest one, and you get this sort of ordering in that sense in terms of number of citations. And we compute the H index in that manner there, where we look at the maximum quantity. Basically, it says that 82 of his publications were cited at least 82 times. An H index of 82 is really quite remarkable. And it's growing because, of course, the body of work continues to be cited, et cetera, et cetera. This dwarfing idea will begin to appear here. So now you take a look at the work on diff, invariance, factorial invariance, item bias. It starts around 1986, the very first paper I have, and I was able to, and it's actually a paper by by Ron and Jane Rogers. And his total citation here is just under 2,000. It's an H-index of 18. In case you're wondering, an H-index of 18, which is just one sliver of Ron's work. In fact, a case could easily be made that Diff was not, he didn't write as many papers in Diff as he did in other areas. Although, quite frankly, just shy of 2,000 citations since 1986 with an H-index of 18 is actually a whole scholarly career on its own. It's really quite remarkable. So we can make a few observations to help contextualize the citation counts of the item bias, detection of diff, and factorial invariance. And of course, we're not going to set aside the overall program and really work on that subset only on the diff. First, these counts and H-index would place the impact of this research theme fifth among the more than 250 scholars worldwide using Google Scholar who self-declare a research focus on the topic. Fifth, as in of the over 250 individuals who self-declare, that of course doesn't include everyone who's interested in the problem, self-declare an expertise or an interest and have published in this area. Fifth, and this is just a sub-theme, this is actually likely a lower bound of the placement. And what I mean by placement means if you think rank order, the placement, because the citation count for the researchers is based on their overall body of research and not just diff. So I didn't go through and remove everyone else's non-diff related research. So it's really a comparison of Ron's sub-work on diff, if you wish, the career on diff itself versus people's entire academic body of work. So there's a confound of treating the impact of Ron's diff thematic research program in comparison to others' overall body of research. So we are imagining that item bias detection of diff and factorial invariance. If we imagine that was all that Ron did, that would put him fifth among the over 250 individuals who self-declare expertise and have publications in the area of diff. That's a pretty remarkable achievement. I mean, just think about it. If he only focused only on diff and only did this work, still make it comparatively a very, very large and important contribution. A few other sort of observations is that the largest number of publications were on psychometric and research methods, followed by adaptation and translation of instruments and cross-cultural research. And my following Ron's work, that actually reflects very much what I saw as well. The three most cited publications are representative of the main foci in Ron's diff and factorial invariance research. Here are the three most cited, the first being Identifying the Causes of Diff in Translated Verbal Items by Avi Halelouf from Knight, Ron Hambleton, and Steve Cerisi. It was in 1999 in the Journal of Measurement, NCME journal. This title has some very wonderful things about it. First of all, it talks about the causes of diff. When I usually use the language of generations of diff. Causes is a third generation. Ron was already doing it with Avi and Steve in 1999. Oh, that's tremendous. The second most cited is Ron and Jane Rogers' work on detecting potentially biased test items, a comparison of IRT area, Mantel Hansel. And his third most cited was a paper that I'm going to spend a few minutes on talking about in a moment, which was his 2006 paper in medical care. It was an invited commentary discussion on good practices for diff. These are actually quite representative of the important contributions that Ron made in this area of research. And it really captures nicely what we're looking at. What the citations, however, don't tell us, the more qualitative analysis, if you wish. Well, they don't tell us is that the good practices paper, this one that I have here, this commentary, but really it's a manuscript. A commentary really understates it. And some commentaries, frankly, are more important than other main bodies of work. What the citation counts don't tell us is that this paper is a real gem, and that Hambleton's view of good practices of diff reflects his decades of diff research. He is clear, however, that he's not the only person to make some of these recommendations. So Ron is, if anyone who worked with him would never want to claim, overclaim his contributions. And my read, however, is certainly some of the recommendations were not made only by Ron, but if you read the whole paper, his positionality gives these ideas richness and breadth, and in some cases breathes new life into some of them. And I'm going to take each of his main suggestions and then make some personal remarks of my own. You're going to see in here that I am in trying to continue, and let me reassure you, it's not easy for me to do so. My apologies, let me just take a moment. I promised myself I wouldn't. So going back to this qualitative work, I want to honor Ron's work and Ron in all of this. Well, you'll hear a little bit later, he was really focused on being critical of his ideas. He really enjoyed, he and I had this, you know, there's many years between us in age, and he's a mentor of mine in in many important ways. But we had this relationship, almost like brotherly relationship, as well as mentor, family member, etc. But sort of teasing each other, keeping each other's on our toes, and really leaving no stone unturned. So I'm going to say a few remarks about each of these places where, from my take, and see what gems are in this work. It really is beautiful work. So he says, begin with the formal judgmental reviews, and after the diff analyses, feed the findings back to instrument developers for future research. It's a good suggestion. Of course, it's highlighting the need to close the loop, provide feedback to instrument developers. It'll be interesting and important to see is how we're going to close this loop with automated item writing tools, and or sometimes called AI item writing technology. It'll be interesting to be able to feed it into that, whether it's done through a large language model or however it's done. It'll be very interesting, not just human item writers, but automated item writers. His second is do not depend exclusively on tests of statistical significance. Although I agree with this, the sentiment of this recommendation, we had many lively debates over the years, Ron and I did, about it. I agree with it in many ways, but then the question is, how should one do this and still maintain error control in testing and maintain the role of statistical testing more generally? That was really a bit of a back and forth, trying to challenge these kinds of ideas. We would debate, because if we're not going to rely only on tests of significance, then there's often this idea of blending some measure of effect size. We would debate whether a blended test was appropriate, and I maintain the position that a blended decision rule may have different characteristics than the unblended rule. And he urged me to work out the mathematics, which I have. It's taken me several years to do so. I've worked out the mathematics of this optimal blended rules. They're not that straightforward. There's a lot of nuances to this. But overall, this is an extremely good idea. And the question is, do we make it part of the decision function, or do we do it something extra statistical or extra psychometric, meaning it's a separate matter judgment afterwards? But if we're going to blend them into the decision, which goes on a fair amount, then this blended rule is something a little different. He says, consider conducting two-stage diff function. Very good idea, right? Of course, it's quite reasonable. We're working toward an unbiased criterion as the matching, and the two-stage approach has us do the one set of analyses to remove diff analyses, and then remove those from the conditioning variable and repeat the diff analyses. Apply multiple procedures and split samples. The availability of several tests, and there's a number of diff tests now, or mousetraps. As Brian Havey had that nice phrase that he used years ago in a symposium that we did together there, group of us at NCME, is the availability of a lot of different tests opens other possibilities, both for misuse, in my opinion, and improvement. I've had many lively debates about this recommendation over the years. I appreciate it all. It's got a lot of ideas to it. But where's the formalism behind this that I want to work out? In particular, if we're considering two or more tests, it is tempting to carry out both at some level alpha, for example, 5%. But for example, report only the more, quote unquote, more significant. This, of course, is not legitimate since the test of the resulting, the level of the resulting test is no longer alpha, it's alpha star, and alpha star is likely to be larger, and in some cases, substantially larger than the original alpha. And so there needs to be a lot of work trying to work out the sort of characteristics of these kinds of blended decision functions of this, or multiple tests kind of functions. Difficulty, in my opinion, can be avoided, as not just me, but many other statisticians can be avoided by letting the data guide us in our choice in a different way than describe this sort of multiple testing. This falls under the class of adaptive testing procedures. It says, of course, consider some IRT variations, the availability of item and test characteristics at various levels of the continuum of variation would certainly add value, and I think it's a great idea. My opinion, and in the opinion of some others, one can consider generalized linear model methods like logistic regression as potentially contributing to this kind of information. So I urge you all to reread Hambleton's 2006 paper, because there are many nuggets of gold and insights into it. And don't take my honoring Ron and continuing to struggle with some of the recommendations as anything other than my admiration for the man, the scholar, and his ideas. And he would say, go prove it, show it, come back, show the mathematics, do the simulation, show me how this works in practice. So all of those things that I had as reflections on his recommendations are really honoring our work that we've done and our life together over 30 years. So let me say a few words about Ron as a model of the life of the scholar and how he influenced my thinking about TIFF and psychometrics. This presentation about the impact of Ron Hambleton's research would not be complete if I did not say a few words about how the countless discussions we had about psychometrics impacted my ideas. Many of you think of Ron as a scholar deeply immersed in the practice. You would be right. Dinners shared with Ron and, for example, Craig Mills and others, but Craig and I and Ron, various cities around the world come to mind when I think of deeply immersed, and where I bore witness to the genius of praxis, actually the genius of praxis in both of them, both coming from Craig and from Ron. But Ron was holding intellectual nuggets that you would watch Craig, a former student of Ron's, just soak these up. And I was bearing witness to this genius of praxis in Ron, and seeing how not only are people challenging him, which he really liked, a respectful challenging of ideas that would advance the field, advancing the ideas were just part of Ron's ideas, Ron's work that drove him, but also this genius of wisdom born out of many years of work. However, he was also a theoretician who constantly was working on theoretically rich innovations. So most people think of him as a deep practitioner, and of course that's true, but he was also a theoretician who was constantly working on theoretically rich innovations. Unbeknownst to some, his command of the literature on classical test theory was, to say the least, humbling, particularly for someone like me who saw myself and see myself as someone who's at least able to wrestle with some of the key ideas in classical test theory and trying to contribute to the modern versions of it. It's amazing to watch Ron, and his command of this literature was tremendous. He loved psychometric theory for its own sake. He loved to talk the history of the discipline, its nuances, and the thorny foundations of our field. He seemed to know everything in my interactions with him. And I could recall, he could recall arcane theorems in psychometrica. First of all, there's not many of us can recall anything from psychometrica, let alone these really arcane theorems from the 1960s into the early 70s and 80s, including the authors, the year of the publication, sometimes whether they were on the right or left side of the page. It's actually quite unnerving to watch something like this, to be quite honest, but it's quite remarkable. But he modeled for me the life of a scholar. In this life of a scholar, a concept or regulative ideal that seems to have sadly mostly been relegated to the bin of old-fashioned quaint ideas of in our neoliberal push for the commodification of everything. Well, Ron was a deep theoretician and a deep thinker of psychometrics, reflected on the history, new papers that before they were even coming out, he would know them in terms of papers that were shared with him. He was able to have his fingers in all of this work, and it was really remarkable to watch and have him as a model of the life of a scholar. We shared a passion for IRT, classical test theory, and practical, but always theoretically justify solutions to complex problems, complex assessment problems. I could always count on him to pull no punches in critiquing my work. And you saw in the last section that he insisted on the same from me. The idea was to leave no stone unturned. A pleasant nod that I agree with what he said was always met with, okay, go back and think about it. I'm not looking for a pat on the head. If you don't agree, challenge my idea, go get the evidence, bring it forward, publish it, pursue it. His goal was always to develop the discipline itself. In fact, Ron and I were having lunch at NCME. Now, I would regale him with my recent developments about forms of conditional probability and its implications for diff. He loved very arcane, sort of esoteric mathematical ideas. And he loved to talk about their implications. He'd like to talk about the implications for modern psychometrics and arcane. One of the problems that we shared in common was diff, and how my new results in calibration theory helped me unpack the nuances of a kind of misclassification error. We would eat, drink, and I'd leave intellectually sated, nourished, but that's left for another time. Let me give you what I'm going to call a bonus track in this section here. Although he had been in the USA since 1969, it would typically be less than 5 minutes into meeting him that you would learn that he was Canadian through and through. He's been a champion of psychometrics and testing in Canada for decades. Our Canadian North Star has served as a beacon of hope and inspiration for many, including me and my former PhD students who he mentored. It was amazing. They would come back from conferences and I met Professor Hambleton, and to them it was like meeting Keith Richards or Mick Jagger or someone like that. Anyway, and he would tell them about the Canadian elements and how we need to contribute to the Canadian part of it. But you all must know that Canada loved Ron back. And so this song here is Canada Loves You Back, I'll Leave It With You. And credits to Stephen Page for writing a song that conveys our message.
They meant to call Drake, but called me by mistake. So you're stuck with a song by this jerk. They asked me to write you a number to show you just how we all feel. We know you're a fan of the land we call Canada, but here's what I've got to reveal: that Canada loves you back. Canada loves you back.